बातें होती हैं, लेकिन औरतों के जो हुकूक होते हैं वो किस तरीके से हमारी इकॉनमी, हमारी मईशत से जुड़े हुए हैं, इसके ऊपर आपका काम भी है रिप्रोडक्टिव हेल्थ का। तो थोड़ा सा हमें औरतों की हेल्थ और उसके हवाले से लिटिगेशन के बारे में बताइए।
ये चल रहा है, अगर मैं यहाँ से ज़्यादा कंफर्टेबल होंगी। ये चल रहा है, इज दिस वर्किंग? यस, ओके ओके, थैंक यू वेरी मच अबीरा। तो मैं अभी कोशिश करूँगी कि ये जो टॉपिक है, जो हमारी थीम है जेंडर, आईड लाइक टू लिंक दिस टू द प्रीवियस डिस्कशंस दैट वीव बीन हैविंग about the economy and about reimagining Pakistan. And I want to start with an issue highlighted earlier that is an economic issue, a development issue, but one that is very closely linked to gender, और वो है population. यहाँ पर भी जो कुछ इस्टीम्ड इकोनॉमिस्ट बैठे हैं उन्होंने ये हाईलाइट किया है कि एक जो पॉपुलेशन एक्सप्लोजन है दैट इज़ वन ऑफ द बिगेस्ट एंड सम माइट से द बिगेस्ट चैलेंज फेसिंग पाकिस्तान राइट नाउ, बिकॉज पाकिस्तान हैज़ द फास्टेस्ट ग्रोइंग पॉपुलेशन इन ऑल ऑफ साउथ एशिया. The birth rates in Pakistan, which is the number of children born per woman in Pakistan, are almost twice as high as that of any other country in South Asia. And why? And okay, this is a cause of concern, of course, because a rapidly growing population is going to put a huge strain on our resources. But ये सिर्फ एक development या economic concern नहीं है, ये एक बुनियादी हकूक की भी एक concern है. Because एक जो आपकी जो unwanted pregnancies हैं, half of all pregnancies in Pakistan are unwanted pregnancies. Because for many complex reasons, women don't have access to contraceptives. So these unwanted pregnancies are putting a huge burden on the welfare of women. And at the same time, these unwanted births, in light of the poor state of maternal health and obstetric care facilities available in Pakistan, also means that Pakistan has one of the highest maternal death rates in the world. But we can talk a lot about population explosion, and we've been raising the alarm on population explosion for some time now, but we're not going to address it unless we understand the cause. And I think many economists would agree with me, many social scientists would agree with me, that Pakistan's failure to stem its population growth is a symptom of systemic and persistent gender inequality. Pakistan is the second worst performing country in the world in terms of gender parity, second worst performing country in the world. In the last report taken out by the World Economic Forum, the gender parity report, Pakistan ranked 145 out of 146 countries. We know that countries that have successfully reduced fertility rates have done so by investing in women's agency and women's empowerment. Bangladesh, Professor Zaidi ne kaha that Bangladesh is our favorite country, and as far as progress on population is concerned, it certainly is, because currently Bangladesh's fertility rate is 2 births per woman, whereas Pakistan's is 3.6 births per woman. But Bangladesh's investment in women's agency and gender empowerment far surpasses that of Pakistan. Bangladesh has one of the lowest gender wage gaps in the world. Its gender wage gap, wages between men and women, is lower than that of some countries in Western Europe. And at the same time, currently, and actually for many years now, there are more girls than boys attending secondary schools in Bangladesh. And these indicators are the causes behind Bangladesh's low fertility rates as well. So to address population explosion, our state must adopt policies and programs that promote women's agency and decision-making capabilities. But we have to acknowledge that there are deep barriers to achieving this, to actually attaining this investment. And there are just a couple that I want to highlight here. One that I'm going to discuss briefly is the role that the distortion of religion has played, particularly in Pakistan's context. In the 1960s, In the 1960s, the founder and leader of Jamaat-e-Islami, Maulana Maududi, declared the then government's family planning program to be against Islam. And although a vast majority of religious scholars today agree that birth control is not contrary to Islam, we know from work on the ground that misperceptions still persist. And there are still confusions regarding the religious acceptability of birth control in Islam. Perceptions that some countries have challenged. Some Muslim countries have managed to influence those perceptions, but in Pakistan, we have not succeeded in doing so. But another significant barrier that I want to focus a little more extensively on is economic austerity. And these are particularly deep barriers because these are economic austerity measures that are imposed on Pakistan in exchange for IMF bailouts. Now, we've talked about austerity measures earlier today also. Miftah Ismail Saab discussed them in detail in his talk, but we know that they involve reduced public sector spending and an increase in taxation, which is often, in our case, regressive taxation. And the impact of IMF-backed austerity measures on women in other countries who have been in an IMF program like Pakistan is now well documented. There is an organization called Action Aid International, which reports that women who do a vast majority of both unpaid care work in households and low-paid care work in public services bear the brunt of austerity measures championed by IMF, especially public sector funding cuts. When public services are underfunded, there is a triple disadvantage for women who disproportionately lose access to services, lose opportunities for decent work, and take on rising burdens of unpaid care work. Spending cuts that target sectors key for human development will harm women and girls disproportionately. Investments in health and education are necessary to achieving gender inequality. Not only do women and girls need better access to health and education services, it is these government departments that tend to hire women and offer employment in the formal sector. Pakistan's Lady Health Worker Program, initiated in the 1990s, is an example of a policy measure with the potential to improve women's access to reproductive health services, including family planning services, while offering good jobs to women from rural and low-income communities. However, lady health workers continue to struggle for regularization of their employment. They continue to struggle for living wages, even as the state compels them to divert energies away from family planning to polio vaccine drives that also put them at grave physical risk. IMF requires imposition of regressive taxes and increased utility surcharges that inevitably place immense burdens on poor households, disproportionately impacting women and girls who also bear the chief burden of unpaid care work. Meanwhile, its demand for exorbitantly high interest rates stifles economic growth and reduces prospects for job growth, thereby reducing opportunities for women in the formal sector. And we've talked about how we need to increase our tax to GDP ratio to get out of the IMF program. We need to decrease public spending to get out of IMF programs. But my question, and there are, qualified economists, people far more qualified in this area, and I still don't have, these are the questions to which I seek answers, that if the very conditions that IMF imposes on us are going to keep us in the debt trap, then how are we going to get out of the debt trap? And I think just as detrimental is the fact that IMF conditionalities do not address the fact that Pakistan's state is essentially a security state. आज I think Kur Saab ने उसको Papa John state कहा, so I prefer that term. That might be a better term to use, where economic investment is skewed towards those sectors that advance the interests primarily of a military bureaucracy, such as real estate, rather than industries that would spur exports and offer formal sector employment to women. Growing our real estate sector is not going to impact women's opportunities to gain financial independence and economic empowerment. So this is something that we need to consider. We had an economic panel here of esteemed economists who talked about the solutions that we need to go forward. And I do wonder if any IMF conditionality talks about those conditions, right? Does IMF make, for example, improving relations with our neighbors a condition to getting a bailout? अकबर जैदी साहब ने कहा कि हम दोस्ती नहीं कर सकते ईरान से क्योंकि IMF फिर हमें शायद लोन ना देगा, लेकिन हम उनसे माशी ताल्लुकात फॉर्मल नहीं बना सकते क्योंकि वरना हमें लोन नहीं देगा. But then I do wonder that we don't have formal economic relations with Iran, but everybody knows that smuggling is happening rampantly. So is decrease of that ever made a conditionality during IMF talks? I'd like to be a fly on the wall. I'm not a fly on the wall in these talks, but I am interested in knowing why IMF conditionalities are not addressing the structural issues, but are instead imposing regressive burdens that are paid for disproportionately by women and girls. And so I just want to end with talking about how the population explosion, which we do raise the alarm on, is tied very closely, and it's a result of a combination of patriarchy, religious extremism, militarization, and neoliberalism, which I'm not talking about neoliberalism as an economic theory or program, but more as a political ideology. Our population explosion is linked to that. And if we want to address it, I don't see how we can do it without tackling these other factors head on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sara. The issue